taxpayer, a new opportunity for the ambitious tenant, and a wake-up call for the people who thought they could count on a free ride.
Washington Journal continues.
As we continue this Sunday, May 18th, C-SPAN's Washington Journal, George McGovern, good morning to you. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Steve.
Pat Buchanan, good morning today.
Well, I'm reading my favorite Sunday Washington Times here. And
why is it your favorite?
Any newspaper that carries my column it shows real class to me, Steve.
How many newspapers do carry your column?
Well, we just started back up again. I don't know how many it is. It was 100 before I left. I don't think we're there yet, but we're starting back uphill.
On to the business at hand. What are you reading?
Well, I guess it's this, the two things, front page stories are the court says Hillary could be indicted, and that female pilot at Air Force Base in North Dakota. These are the two top stories in the Times. The Hillary thing, actually, it seems to me there's almost less here than meets the eye, because obviously if the independent counsel is going after the notes of Hillary Rodham Clinton after she met with the grand jury, he's taken a hard look at Hillary Rodham Clinton, and this simply confirms that fact, but it does elevate it in the news again, and my guess is they're not having a happy morning over in the White House about it.
George McGovern, what are you reading today?
Well, you know, I can't keep up, Steve, with all the books that are coming out these days, so I've fallen into a pattern here of reading book reviews, so at least I know what's out. I'm trying to see what's on the bestseller list. I was looking at the Washington Post book world at people who have made the bestseller list. I noticed Kay Graham's book, which is marvelous, is still on. So is Frank McCord's Angela's Ashes. It's a great novel. But a book that caught my attention, which I've read, is Bob Rice's book, Locked in the Cabinet. By the way, things to say about Pat Buchanan in that book.
Is that unusual?
Yeah. Well, I suppose Robert, the most liberal member of the cabinet, wouldn't you say, Pat?
I think he was. What he was talking about was the issue back there in the New Hampshire days in February a year ago, when the issue of the falling people became an issue in our campaign in New Hampshire. And Bob Rice was urging the president to seize upon that because he felt this might help him with the swing votes in November. But I read parts of that book. I had Bob Rice on Crossfire, and I found him very sort of critical of his old friend from Oxford days, that the president was very pragmatic, and he never seemed to go back to his roots. He was Dick Morrisized, if you will.
Yeah. Well, I think Bob Rice believes that the central economic problem we're faced with in this country is the fact that at a time when the stock market is booming, and the people at the top, including the corporate executives, are doing better than they ever have before, ordinary working people are either stagnant in terms of they're worse off than they were 15, 20 years ago. That you were the candidate that talked most forcefully about that in 1996. It dropped out. The issue disappeared. He's trying to put the heat on President Clinton. Obviously, they're close friends, but he recognizes that the leadership of both of the political parties have lost touch with these low-income workers.
Senator, that's exactly right. As a matter of fact, I'm working on my own book. I doubt if it's going to be as readable as Mr. Reich's, but the corporate executives, they used to make an average of the top CEOs 40 times the average. In 1996, it was 212 times the income of an average worker. The top 1% now has 40% of America's wealth. In 1946, it was 21%. Now, I don't have any problem with people getting very, very wealthy, but even U.S. News talks about the amazing economy here, and this story on immigration in the New York Times is that people who don't graduate from high school, and even high school graduates, are seeing their wages really decline. And one of the reasons is, I believe, quite frankly, is all the goods coming in from abroad, which are made by low-wage labor. And secondly, the enormous numbers of immigrants who come into the country recently who compete for those jobs and drive down those wages.
Bob Rice makes an interesting point that historically we've had what he calls a kind of a social contract under which if corporate profits go up, then the wages of the workers that fuel those industries ought to go up. It doesn't work that way. What has happened is that as corporate profits have gone up and the stock market has boomed, and laid off, or their wages have been frozen. And you have a situation where corporate executives are promoted not on the basis of improvement of their industry, but the fact that they the price of the stocks.
And that elevates their own stock options as well. Their interests, you're exactly right, Senator, but in my judgment, the reason is this worship of the global economy. Now, these corporate profits are more competitive than European and others because they've moved more rapidly to take their plants offshore, whether it's Mexico or East Asia or China, and they trade in their first world workers for third world who work in third world conditions, and they bring the products back to the United States, and of course the profits soar, the dividends soar, and the salaries soar. But the working people in the United States, in my judgment, especially those who work in tools and machines, their real standard of living has been falling steadily, and I think we're becoming two nations. And it used to be, as you said, in the 50s, when we prospered, we all prospered together. Or in the 30s, when we had hard times, everybody had a hard time. But it's different now. One part is prospering extraordinarily in this economy, there's no doubt about it, but another part is marking time.
Both of our distinguished guests will be with us for a full hour. We'll get to your calls in just a moment. I want to ask you, Pat Buchanan, about this piece in the New York Times. It's called "This Toasters an All-American Import That Is, Well, Sort of." And the story is based in part on the Federal Trade Commission, which has spent 2 years studying the issue of what is made in the USA. And what they came up with the conclusion in this economy of international manufacturing realities is that if a product is substantially all made in the USA, then it would get a Made in the USA label.
Well, you know, I'm very much in favor of Americans if the product's been made by American workers. Because again, you know, let's take one example, the automobiles. We used to make all our cars here in the United States and Americans bought. 1 million of them made in Canada. And last year, while we exported 46,000 automobiles to Mexico, we imported 550,000. Now the Mexican automobile industry is transplanted there to very low wages, and so by abandoning the American workers, this enables the profits of the company to go up. But I haven't seen the wages of American auto workers going up.
Pat, I think if Bob Reich were here, he'd continue to give you good marks for raising this issue. He'd probably
not get good marks.
Yeah, you'd probably, and it is a complicated question. I think the problem of the global economy is one that we're going to have to learn to live with. We are in a global economy. We can't pull out of the world. We can't segregate our operations from the rest of the world. What we can do, though, I think, is provide more protection for our own workers. We can follow policies that don't encourage corporate industry to downsize, to lay off people just at the time when they're making maximum profits. I think there are ways that probably are more fundamental than simply pointing a finger at the country of immigrants. We all trace our ancestry back to other countries. So I don't think that's the key problem. It's a question of fairness in the way we handle our federal budget, our tax policy, our dealings with our own people. And I think the Reich book is on sound ground in terms of the solution as well as the problem.
I disagree with Brother Reich on the solution. He talks a great deal about education, and there's no education is needed, but these folks in the working force that are 21, 20 years old now with 40, 50 more years in the labor force, many of them got out of high school without really a high school degree or without being able to read at high school level. You're not going to be able to train them to handle it, but they can build cars and radios and TVs and machines. Senator, I think the problem is the reason these companies are going abroad is because we've given them an economic incentive to do so. I mean, if you say to them, fire your first world workers, don't worry about EEOC or OSHA or wage and hour laws. You don't have those in Indonesia. You get hard workers over there, you get lousy conditions, you got low pay, but you can bring back free of charge. Senator, I'm going to give you a book on my hero, William McKinley. He had some interesting ideas on this with the with the tariff, frankly, which is a way that you adjust the prices of goods made by inexpensive labor in bad conditions with those made by Americans.
Well,
top-notch condition.
We were led to believe that if we approved these international trade agreements, NAFTA specifically, that protections would be written in terms of American worker standards and also environmental standards and the other things that we believe are important to the quality of life. I don't think we've kept faith with that commitment.
I'm going to jump in. We were showing, while both of you were talking, excerpts inside U.S. News and World Report, the cover that Pat Buchanan pointed out, The Amazing Economy. George McGovern, what else are you reading today?
Well, I've been looking at Washington Post lead editorial today on the budget deal. I don't know how interested people are in this budget deal, but the gist of the Post editorial is that so much effort has been made on getting a deal and eliminating the more controversial parts that what they've ended up with is not all that exciting. It does include, as the Post points out, a tax cut, but it's a tax cut, unfortunately, that benefits primarily the people that least need it. It's not going to reach the ordinary citizen. 90% of the people watching us on C-SPAN today are not going to get any tax cut under the terms of this bill or anything substantial in any. What this budget deal does is to make sure we protect the elderly under Social Security. It makes sure that there's a tax cut primarily for the higher income people. When you do those two things, that puts a lot of pressure on the rest of the budget if you're going to try to reduce the deficit. It means that programs for working people, for the schools, for research, all of those things are going to have to be trimmed. And the Post makes what I think is essentially a fair conclusion. They say that in outline, there's not going to be much improvement in fiscal policy. There's going to be some regressive changes in tax policy and a weaker government less capable of carrying out its basic functions. I don't think that's a very auditory result that we've brought forth.
I wish it were a weaker government, Senator McGovern, but I don't think it's going to be. But I do agree that that this is really a near-beer solution, 3.2. The Republicans don't want to fight with Bill Clinton. They were in 1995. They've lost the will to fight on the grounds of their philosophy, lay out their own separate, strong budget, and to oppose it to that of Bill Clinton's. And Clinton doesn't want to fight. You know, Senator, I'll tell you, I think that what you've got in your president here is basically a Democratic Eisenhower. Clinton is presiding over the consolidation somewhat of Reaganism and his ideas, leaving them in place, whereas beneath Clinton, his party atrophies because it's got no core philosophy any longer. But Clinton, it enables Clinton to play the centrist and to be elected and re-elected because he's not controversial. And I think we're sort of in a transition period, just like the 50s. Senator McGovern's movement basically rose up and took over the Democratic Party, and the Goldwater movement came up and, dissatisfied with Eisenhower and all the rest of it, took over the Republican Party. So I think we're suspending politics here for a period of about 4 years until the philosophy of both parties decides they're going to get up and do battle over what they believe.
Who would lead that movement in the Republican Party?
That's an interesting question, Steve. I don't know.
It's interesting. You refer to the Eisenhower period. Eisenhower was in power when I came to Congress in 1957, but the Democrats had both the House and the Senate. Sam Rayburn, Lyndon Johnson, the Senate. And it's probably inevitable when you have divided government like that, you're going to have a president and a Congress that tends to move more towards the center. If Clinton had a strong Democratic House and the Senate, the chances are they'd be putting the heat on him to move on some of the things he's now soft-pedaling.
Two quick points, and I want to get your reaction, and we'll get to some calls. Dick Morris has a piece in the National Review. Pat Buchanan has a balanced budget.
Dick Morris is writing for National Review?
Yes, he is. Consultant to President Clinton.
Times do change,
Lott.
don't they?
He says, politically, this budget deal, an act of bipartisanship, has ended the probationary period of Congress and of Democratic control of the White House. Voters have seen their wisdom in their ways in dividing control of the government. I
don't really believe that voters go into the ballot box and say, I want to elect Clinton, but I want to put a check on him there. I think this is simply the way that things come out. But clearly, you know, with regard to the Republican Congress, though, I think what the Republicans are doing is, again, they've been burnt by 95. They see 98 as a second off-year election, natural gains for Republicans. They see all these scandals breaking, which can only benefit the Republican Party. I think they're going to mark time until the year 2000 when they hope to get a president and a Congress both. And it's not an unreasonable strategy politically, but it's not a very exciting one. And those who believe that there's a lot of things that need to be addressed and aren't being addressed, I think are going to be dissatisfied in both parties.
Oak Brook, Illinois, good morning. Hello.
Hi. I want to say hello to Senator McGovern. I really admire him. But to Mr. Buchanan, you're complaining about the dire situation of workers. Strikes me as a bit, I don't know, absurd, since you're the people who you worked for, Nixon and especially Reagan, weakened the labor unions, cut taxes for the rich, making a greater burden for ordinary working Americans. And actually, we do need strong government to check, you know, big corporations. That's the way that, you know, corporations don't run roughshod over the people of the country.
All right, let me look. If you take a look, ma'am, at the median income of the American family. Now, in the Nixon years, Carter years, it went down dramatically. Under Reagan, it went back up again, and then under Presidents Bush and Mr. Clinton, until about 1995, it went down again to the family income was down about 6% in the 1990s, but it went up under Reagan. I don't agree that we ought to be controlling corporations or interfering with them. We ought to structure tax and trade policies so that corporate executives take a look at these policies and they say, it is in our interest, economic interest, to build our next plant or factory right here in the United States of America, because it's going to be too expensive for us to do it overseas for a variety of reasons. So we give them incentives to do what they ought to be doing patriotically, basically. And I think you can do that without inside the corporation or telling what the stockholders or what the directors or what the executives ought to do. And if you structure the economic incentives the right way, all these things can happen without interference.
I think the woman caller, though, has made an interesting point, Pat. During the 1980s, in the Reagan period, two fundamental things happened that I think were not in the interest of the ordinary American. One was a very substantial reduction in taxes, primarily at the top. The average American didn't benefit very much from that. I think to the top 20%. That probably added $1 trillion to the national debt during that period. At the same time that we were cutting taxes $1 trillion during the 80s, under the Reagan-Bush period, we increased military outlays by $1 trillion. And that became the formula for these enormous deficits that have forced a squeeze on all the rest of the budget, including all the programs that benefit ordinary people. So you talk about not wanting to increase the size of the government. What about the enormous increases that were made in the military side in that period? I think those are questions that need to be raised. I think that with the Clinton administration today, I support President Clinton. He's been to mine for 25 years. But I would like to see him redeem some of the commitments that were made when he first bid for the White House to increase the public investment side on the schools, on roadways, on health care, and these other things that I think benefit ordinary citizens.
Well, let me tell you, there's no doubt that Ronald Reagan if he didn't initiate, he continued a build-up that began around 1980 in the military of the United States and the armed forces, a dramatic increase, and he put pressure on the Soviet Union through the Reagan Doctrine, through missiles in Europe, through aid in Afghanistan and Angola. He built up the United States technology militarily and all the rest of it. There's no doubt about that. But as a consequence, George, we won the Cold War, and the Soviet Empire collapsed. And when the United States did go to war in Iraq and did go to war in the Persian Gulf, the technology and the weaponry that Ronald Reagan had provided for the American military enabled us to win that war with a loss that nobody predicted in the dozens of men in a major war with a country with a 1 million-man army. And this is an extraordinary achievement. Now, on the economic side, Ronald Reagan did cut taxes. Now, see, I view tax cuts not simply as transfers of income. Actually, all the money belongs to the people initially since they earned it. But what is the economic impact of the kind of taxes you're cutting? Reagan did cut the top level like Jack Kennedy did from 92 to 70. Kennedy did. Reagan took it all the way to 28%. But the economic boom in those years, what impresses me is what happened to the median family income, which started back up again. Now, in recent years, I agree with you. The median family income's gone down. Real wages are stagnant. If we can get those up, I mean, I'll go for the policy.
A viewer from Philadelphia faxes in regarding the decline of standard of living workers. Dan Valentine says James Glassman of the Washington Post had a great idea. Eliminate all taxes on the working class. This mostly means getting rid of Social Security and Medicare taxes on less than $30,000 a year. We could pay for it by cutting entitlements or by raising income taxes.
Well, I do think the way that tax is structured, it's one of the more regressive taxes, but we can't operate the Social Security program and Medicare without the withholding tax. There might be you could make a strong case that if we're going to have a tax reduction, that's where it should come. That's one that would help the average citizen, but I wouldn't remove it entirely.
Another fact said that there's no difference between Democrats and Republicans. That is why everybody was against Pat. Go, Pat, go.
That cutting all taxes under, that sounds like Steve Forbes. The second one sounds like one of our folks. Well, here's the thing. There's no doubt that the establishment, certainly the Republican Party, I think the establishment of the Democrats were watching with interest and amusement at the time of the New Hampshire primary. But there's no doubt that the establishment of the Republican Party, when it saw us break through, rallied en masse to Senator Dole and came down on us very hard because we were in their judgment, in danger of taking away the nomination.
I want each of you to select a story from the morning newspapers. I want to shift gears, if I could, for just a second, and then we'll get back to calls. In 1971, 1972, you were working for Richard Nixon.
Right.
What did he think of George McGovern? How did he view him as a political opponent?
Well, I'll tell you, I was Richard Nixon's key man. He had me analyze all the Democrats, and we probably shouldn't have been doing that in the White House, but we took all their clippings and things like that, and I was the only one that predicted that McGovern would be the nominee, could be beaten. I think Nixon's great fear, Nixon always had an apprehension of candidacy, and I said, I don't think you need to worry about candidacy. I think we have to worry most about Muskie. But Senator McGovern had something that always concerns you. He has a force of volunteers, of dedicated, true believers who have real energy and fire and passion, who will go to the wall for you. I thought Senator McGovern's base was smaller. But on a personal level, President Nixon respected Senator McGovern very much as a war hero and a dedicated, devout liberal. As we used to say, he's one of the most dedicated liberals we know of anywhere.
Was there ever a point where Nixon thought that George McGovern would have beaten him? There
was a point in which the White House mess in that little office was very frightened of Senator McGovern. And it was when Senator New Hampshire and after the Florida primary where Wallace won and Muskie was just eliminated, and Senator Muskie made that foolish statement down there. But Senator McGovern was starting to roll, and it was very, very exciting. And there was a tremendous interest and excitement, and there were many members of the White House staff who were deeply apprehensive. I remember sitting there at the table, and I said, look, if Senator McGovern represents the core of the Democratic Party, if we can't win that, we can't win. But I'll be honest, I thought that we could beat Senator McGovern because Nixon could occupy the center of American politics, and we could paint Senator McGovern on the left, which we said you really attempted to do, and I leave it to Senator McGovern to say whether or not we succeeded.
Well, it was a clever campaign. The ads that were run against me were clearly designed to paint me as far to the left as possible, probably much further than I actually was. Let me just say, as long as you've gotten into 72, Steve and Pat, I think the day Wallace was shot, just a month before the Democratic National Convention, and denied, therefore, the opportunity to run as an independent, I think that was the day that President Nixon was home free. Why do I say that? Because Wallace was stronger in 72 than he was 4 years earlier in 68. I think he was capable in 72, had he not been shot, of running as an independent and taking the South away from Nixon and probably a good share of the blue-collar vote in the North.
Well,
if that had happened, we'd have had a three-way race. I'd have come very close either to winning or at least making it a real horse race.
That's undeniable. Let me say that I don't know if Governor Wallace could have run as a third-party candidate after he'd come back into the Democratic Party and run in all those primaries. But we did an analysis of it was a precinct in Florida in the general election of Wallace's 123 votes Wallace got in the primary in that county. They ran down, Nixon got 122 of them. What happened was the Wallace movement came en masse to Richard Nixon. Wallace had gotten 13% back in 1968. Nixon had 43%, Humphrey had 43%. Nixon got 60% in 1972. The whole Wallace movement en masse came over to the Republican Party. And frankly, we had been his voters for 4 years with
that's what the Southern strategy
That's what the Southern strategy was all about.
It's amazing to me that commentaries on that 70 they keep talking about the debacle campaign. What they mean is that we lost as heavily as we did, but they don't look to the reason for that, which was essentially that it became the Wallace vote combined with the Nixon vote against a senator from South Dakota, George McGovern. It was a no contest from that point on. If we had had the same situation we had in '68 when my friend Hubert Humphrey was the Democratic nominee, I think we'd have had a result about the same, a very tight race.
There's no doubt if Wallace had been healthy and he had been able to run third party, he was at the peak of his game, as they say, he was winning primary. I mean, he won Florida with 42%.
He was the toughest contender I had for the nomination.
And he was carrying places like South Boston, and it would have been a three-way race, you're right, it would have been much, much closer. There would have been no 49-state landslide, and there probably would have been a lot more beads of sweat there in that White House mess.
Got to get some phone calls in. Memphis, Tennessee, good morning.
Good morning. Hi, Pat.
Hi there.
I'm thrilled to be talking to you. It's the first time I've ever been tongue-tied calling C-SPAN. I wanted to tell you that you're right. Anybody that's been to the grocery store or paid a phone bill or paid a cable television bill or anything knows that this economy is sick. And also, I wanted to ask you a question.
Sure.
I heard one of the commentators say that Clinton counts these jobs for every $1 billion we export. That's 14,000 jobs. Well, does that work the other way? That every $1 billion that's imported, we've lost $14,000?
Well, you know, actually, Clinton and Bush both are on record as saying for every $1 billion in exported goods, it means 20,000 jobs in the United States. Last year, we had a merchandise trade of things we make with our hands and with tools and machines of $187 billion. Now, if 20,000 jobs are with each $1 billion, that's a loss of almost 4 million manufacturing jobs. The number of Americans in manufacturing was 21 million. It's now around 18 million. Around 15% of the labor force. You're exactly right, ma'am. There are people in this economy, frankly, journalists and entrepreneurs and lawyers and financiers and bankers and others are doing extraordinarily well. Top 20% is doing unbelievably well. But the vast majority of middle America is stagnant, or it's going down, or it's going up slowly. And this is the real problem, I think. If Republicans would address this, and it cost us the pro voters in 1992, and it cost us some voters in 1996, if they would sit and come up with some ideas for it, we could put those folks back home.
George McGovern, born in Mitchell, South Dakota, graduate of Dakota Wesleyan, is that correct?
That's correct.
What did your degree in?
In history. Anyway, I've got an item here I'd like to comment on, Steve, and it's this issue of campaign finance. We've talked here 2 or 3 times today about how the parties seem to be moving closer and closer together. I suspect one of the reasons for that is that they're bankrolled by the same people in all too many cases. This article on the front page of the Post today about Senator Bob Torricelli, who's a very skillful campaign fundraiser in the business and an effective senator. he raised over $9 million, but his opponent in New Jersey raised about $8.5. So there's nothing about the Torricelli campaign that's much different from others. But it's interesting to me, they point out in this article, while generally the business PACs supported Zimmer, who was Torricelli's opponent, the labor PACs tended to support Torricelli. But then this interesting point, 80 of the PACs, political action committees, gave to both candidates. And that's a growing pattern. There was a congressman from Kansas here a few years ago. He said one of the reasons that we're not really championing the people up here in the Congress anymore in either party as much as we should is that we're all feeding out of the same trough. I think we have to do something about campaign finance.
Well, I could not agree more. And one of the real problems is in presidential campaigns you're allowed to accept a $1,000 contribution and $5,000 from a PAC. I think first they ought to take the PAC contributions, if they can't get rid of them under the Supreme Court decision, at least cut them back to $1,000. Secondly, it's the soft money that is the big problem. You get a corporation or someone puts $250,000 into a national committee, or $100,000 or $50,000. Both political parties are totally dependent on that to keep those huge staffs and salaries and all the rest of it. And that's why when those corporate chief gives you $250,000, when he's on the phone and asking you why you're voting for some amendment, you tend to listen to him and maybe change your mind. If they could get rid of the soft money, get rid of the packed money, or if you can't get rid of it, cut it down to $1,000 or whatever it is, I think you could go a long way to doing this. And the third thing I would do is get these congressmen and senators, require them to raise 50% or 75% in their home state or their home district, so at least the folks contributing to them is the guy down at the corner drugstore or the local businessman. It's not somebody, Cargill or someone, who's dumping the money into your campaign.
Pat Buchanan was born in Washington, D.C., graduated of Georgetown.
I was born in Washington, D.C., went to high school 2 blocks down the street, Steve, and went to college as a day hop at Georgetown. It was a different town. It was an old southern town during World War II in the 1950s, and a great place to grow up and live.
Do you still have that Mercedes-Benz in McLean, Virginia?
I sold that after the '92 campaign, and I cried all the way out to Route 123 as they took it away.
George McGovern just asked you.
I have a nice little Cadillac now.
One of the
American car.
That's right.
Graduate of Northwestern as well for your PhD, but I want to ask you about something we read in the paper this past week about a possible appointment for you as the U.S. representative to food and agriculture at the UN. Any truth to that story?
Well, first let me say one thing. I haven't applied for any appointments, and I haven't president about any appointment, nor has he talked to me. He's the one that will make this appointment if it's been made. I had an inquiry at the staff level as to whether I would be interested. I've had a long time interest in the food and agricultural issues before the country and before the world, and I said I would certainly take a look at it, but I've heard nothing from the president about this, so any comment on my part would be premature.
This, I guess, was based on the question I had asked you. This is Pat Buchanan. This is George McGovern. And yes, I worked for Nixon, and I forgive you. You, George McGovern. And I think that's me, but I'm not sure.
They put that sketch together that fast and got it on the fax up here. That is all right.
It is from William Culver. I'm not sure where he's from. 563 area code, one of those new area codes.
I don't know where that one is.
Steve, just to stir up a little difference between Pat and me here today.
You don't forgive him?
We've had a little bit too much of a love in here this morning. Pat to be comfortable, but in any event, I disagree with the notion that this enormous military buildup in the '80s contributed to the end of the Cold War. If we're going to credit for the tough line on the Soviet Union, you have to go back to Harry Truman. Most presidents have followed essentially that same policy of making sure we were militarily strong, that we were behind NATO, and that we did the things we had to do. But I think what happened in the 1980s is that it was at a time when we should have been making moves towards ending the Cold War short of a huge military buildup. The Soviet system collapsed primarily because it was a lousy system. We know that now. We know that they were economically bankrupt, that their agriculture was in a mess, that they weren't near as strong as we thought they were militarily. I think the whole thing collapsed of its own inner weaknesses. And what Gorbachev did was to recognize that this arms race was a no-win deal for either side.
Well, you know,
and the suggestion that we bring it under control. I give him a lot of credit for that.
well, but that's a little like giving Hirohito credit for bringing peace to the Pacific in 1945.
It's not, because you had, in the case of World War II, you had total war going on with a country that attacked us.
But let's take Gorbachev, Senator. I was in the White House in those years when 85, 86, 87. Reagan's military buildup had put extraordinary pressure on the Soviets. We now know they were spending not 13% or 16% of GDP, but something like 33% on the military.
That's one of the reasons they collapsed.
That's one of the reasons they collapsed.
Is that a healthy thing to do for us to put that kind of strain on our economy in order to crack somebody else up economically?
Senator, this Cold War, as you pointed out, had been going on since 1945, maybe before. In 1979 and 80 under Carter, look what happened. Or just after Vietnam collapsed, they went into Afghanistan. Iran collapsed. They were in Angola and Mozambique and Ethiopia. They were in Grenada and Nicaragua. Americans felt we were completely on the defensive. Euro-communism was the great movement of the hour. Reagan came in, I think, restored our morale, rebuilt our military power, put pressure on the Soviets, especially with strategic defense. I was at Reykjavik. Gorbachev said, I'll take the deal, but you got to get rid of SDI. Reagan said no. It's one of the few times I've seen him explode. And then finally, I think Gorbachev, who had been putting all that effort into Afghanistan, finally said, we got to chuck it. We can't do it anymore. I think what broke him and what broke them, there's no doubt you had good Cold War presidents, Jack Kennedy, Harry Truman, but it was one under Ronald Reagan and George Bush.
You know what we've learned now, and you know this, with information that's irrefutable, that we all along were exaggerating the military power of the Soviet Union. We were exaggerating their economic power. We should have been moving years ago to work out some accommodation to end this Cold War. I think we're still spending too much on military outlays, almost as though the Cold War were still in process.
I'm going to jump in. We have a number of callers who have been very patient. Bronx, New York, good morning.
Hi, good morning. I'm really pleased with the show. I'm enjoying the discussion.
Thank you.
I sort of have a comment on this discussion's been a little bit around work and the economy. It seems to me we're in a period now, the way we were at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in this country. A lot of things are going to be happening that will change the nature of work and how we relate to each other and all. And back then, a lot of bad things happened that we spent like the next 100 years trying to undo. These sort of issues don't seem to be discussed. In particular, like the economy seems to work in such a way that it eliminates jobs. Technology does that, and I'd refer you to something like The End of Work by Jeremy Rifkin, that type of a situation. I'm wondering, what we can do now to avoid having these bad things happen that we'll have to undo, for the next century afterward. What sort of things can we do? Is there, can we discuss it in some way, make it more public more aware of these kind of things? I'm just kind of at a loss as to how to proceed here.
Caller, we also have a fax from a viewer from Michigan who says that, referring to Pat Buchanan, I make about $30,000 a year in the service sector. Last year I bought a 27-inch TV for $320. It was made in China. Under your plan, I would have to pay $500, so some factory worker here could be entitled to a job. A special interest would benefit. I would say no thanks. Do you agree or disagree with that, caller?
That's sort of my point. It's beside the point whether that job gets put in China or put in America. At some point in the future, technology will be at such a point where the job won't exist in either place.
Pat Buchanan?
Well, let me talk about that TV set. If it was made in China, clearly it did not cost $500 to make when you got 25 cents an hour labor. It was probably a Western corporation or a Japanese corporation that made it. And so what they did, they made it maybe for $30, and they come over here and they sell it for $500, and they pocket the difference. Now, the gentleman says that he doesn't care about the American fellow who made those TV sets, that he's not going to subsidize him. But if that American worker is on the unemployment line, or his wages have gone down because he's tending bar now, and his wife had to go get a job as a waitress, even though they got a 4 or 5-year-old kid, you got your society breaking down. I mean, we all have to be in this together. Now, my point would be, in the type of tariffs I would approve of, I would put tariffs on manufactured goods made in low-wage countries abroad that compete unfairly because they cheat their workers at the expense of Americans. But you take the revenue from that tariff, and worked right, you can get several hundred from it, the way I've got it worked out in my own plan, and you take that and cut taxes on small business in the United States, cut some off Social Security, cut taxes on interest income to encourage saving, and put in some incentive tax cuts, which Senator McGovern might disagree with. But in other words, shift the burden of taxation onto consumption of foreign goods and off incomes of working Americans.
Could I make a couple of suggestions to this question, which I think is really a good one? It's true, we're moving into a new age where I do think people in many cases are going to have to be retrained. I was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota yesterday, and there was a story in the Argus Leader about the Camel Soup Company closing a plant in Worthington, Minnesota, where they process chickens. And there are about 400 or 500 people that may lose their. One of the local men said, if the company's going to retrain us to do something else, I hope it'll be something where we can improve our status. He said, for example, some of us need to be trained as carpenters. Some of us might be trained to repair diesel engines. These are things that are in short supply. And I believe that's true. I think that the government's going to have to invest some money, private industry is going to have to invest some money in retraining people and helping them get equipped for this new age that we're moving into. The gentleman is right about technology replacing a lot of workers, but there are technical jobs that people can be trained to do, and we're going to have to move in that direction.
Senator, but technology, people say, well, technology's moving very fast, we got computers and things. Look at the 19th century, for late 19th century, you got these inventions of, electricity, the phonograph, the automobile, the air. The technological change was far greater in America, I think, than it is right now.
No, I don't agree with that.
Well, it's just, it was extraordinary. But the thing is, where the gentleman was wrong who called in, is that the real wages of working Americans soared between 1865 and 1914. The number of, we needed workers our doors to millions of immigrants. In other words, labor increased, and as technology is, as one thing as the automobile replaced the horseless carriage and all the rest, people went from one job to another. But now the jobs, this Campbell's soup job, my guess is it's like all these toy companies and things. When they shut down, they're headed for Mexico or Indonesia or Asia. You get a little town loses 500 jobs, it's not coming back. Maybe a company will come in 3 years. What are they going to do in those 3 years?
At the end of World War II, we had what was known as the GI Bill of Rights, under which I and 3 or 4 million other GIs were educated. It provided the leadership and the workforce at the top in this country for the next 50 years. I think we need something like that again. The Cold War's over. We're going to begin seeing the closing of more and more bases, the cutback on defense contracts. We need a combination of two things. We need education to prepare people for these changes, and secondly, we're going to have some public investment to provide jobs in the public sector as well as in the private sector. There are a lot of public things that need to be done in this country. We can look out this window and see the in the streets here in Washington. We know that here in Washington our drinking system is not safe.
But
they have to be replaced.
But Washington, D.C., with due respect, Washington, D.C. is one of the highest taxed communities in the nation, in the United States of America. They spend $10,000 per child.
I'm not citing it as a model. I think it's true of cities all over the country. There are things that need to be done. People need to be put to work doing useful things.
Government employment in 1946 has more than tripled in the United States, whereas manufacturing employment has fallen. The point is, it's these private sector manufacturing jobs where men can make $25 an hour, $30 an hour, $40 an hour, raise a whole family on one income. these are the jobs that are going overseas, and I don't think you can make up for them by taxing the rest of us and in doing make-work jobs or something like that.
I'm not talking about new taxes. I'm talking about what we're going to do as the defense outlays decline. How are we going to put people to work? You can't absorb all of them in private industry. We have the defense workers are paid by the United States government indirectly.
Right now,
I'm going to jump in.
Sure. Okay.
Because we have about 10 minutes left. I have from Sterling, Virginia, facts for you. Pat Buchanan specifically asked the question, will he run again as president, this time as an independent?
Will he run again as a candidate, I think, right? I mean, is it, or as an independent?
Yes.
I have not really, look, I'm sort of out of politics now for the next 2 years until after the 1998 election. I don't have a PAC. I'm busy paying off a debt. I'm full-time in journalism, not doing anything political. We'll take a look after 1998, but I do believe this, that the Republican Party has got to start addressing the issues of the working people and the middle class, the forgotten Americans, because if it doesn't, some new party is going to come into existence. They've had a lot of warnings from the Reform Party, the Taxpayer Party, and everything else, splitting off from the GOP. Many Democrats are concerned about these same issues. So I think everybody should keep all their options open, but disappointed in the leadership of my own party in the Congress of the United States, that it's not bolder or more imaginative. I think it is frozen, frankly, in the 1980s.
The interesting thing is the biggest political party in the United States is no longer either the Republicans or the Democrats. It's the people that don't vote.
Right.
And one of the reasons I'm convinced that tens of millions of people have given up voting is that they don't think it makes much difference in their lives. And so the two parties are going to have to stake out positions that are more real in the lives of ordinary people than they've yet done.
Time magazine previews summer. The cover story is what's cool this summer. We'll show you that. Also, Newsweek magazine takes a look at the issue of asthma, how it's spreading people in this country. And the Weekly Standard has permanent offense. A piece by Fred Barnes says that the agenda for Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich is one to permanently remain on the offense. Why? Because it's the only way you can win in this town. Agree or disagree?
Well, I don't know what that means exactly.
Well, let me continue. He says, no political figure has managed this since President Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal era 60 years ago. It's Gingrich, who believes he will take 6 to 10 years for Republicans to replace, not merely reform, the welfare state and the status quo in Washington. That's if all goes well, which means staying on offense.
I suspect one of the reasons Mr. Gingrich has been on the defense so much is that he keeps making mistakes. And you have to defend yourself when you do that, and maybe the temptation is to go on the offense against somebody else to divert attention from your own problems. I would put it this way, that I think any politician ought to give more time to his own program and the positive things he has to produce than he does attacking other people.
Carrier, Mississippi, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you this morning?
Good morning. Fine, thank you.
This business, the economy being so well, I've been in the workforce for 50 years. And over the last 50 years, I've seen the value of the dollar depreciate constantly. Now it's got to where it's worth hardly anything. The only people that are really doing well in this country is a political force in Washington, D.C. They're the only ones that I feel are secure in any form. As long as they have a grip on the taxpayers' money, they will take care of themselves. And they could care less about the taxpayer themselves.
Well, there's no doubt there's a fine socialist system working up on Capitol Hill, and where the job security is far greater than it is in the economy, and the pensions are far beyond anything you're going to get in the private sector. There's no question about it, sir. And let me agree in part with what, I don't want to get back to this comity of the earlier period, Senator, but I think Senator McGovern is right. I mean, this statement from the Weekly Standard, what it suggests is all tactics. This political tactic, that political tactic. Now, that's all well and good, but tactics behind what strategy and strategy behind what agenda? What is our bold agenda? What do we believe in? What is the kind of America we want to see in the year 2010? What are the steps we're going to take to reach it? This is what we ought to be laying out specifically, clearly, and say, here's what we want to, here's where we want to go. Support us, and we'll take you there. It may be short steps now, longer steps later, but the idea of being on the offensive or being on the defensive, this is all tactics and strategy, and It consumes an enormous amount of the journalism in this town.
Jordan McGovern, Lori Kelman writes below the fold in the Washington Times that it's lacking any sort of support in the Republican conference, in part because the agenda includes abolishing illegal drugs from America, improving education, and cutting teen pregnancy.
What are they referring to?
That's Newt's agenda.
That's the Speaker's priorities, which, as Lori Kelman writes in the Washington Times, hard to oppose these issues.
Yeah.
But what else is there? Is her conclusion based on talking to Republican leaders in the House and the Senate?
I think Pat and I have been talking about move a lot of people more than anything else, and that's dealing with the problems of the lower income workers in this country who are not doing well. The gentleman who just called in said that we're talking about how Pat and I certainly haven't been talking about that. What we've said is that the top 20% are doing great. It's all well and good to say how well the Congress is doing, but certainly the corporate executives across this country are doing better than ever.
Remember what we're talking about.
The stockholders are doing better than ever. It's the
Dow's at 7,000.
It's a person like this hard-working guy who just called in that aren't getting their fair share of the fair share of what's going on. Let me just add one point here too, Steve. I believe that one of the basic problems with our political leadership today is that there's too much attention to what the latest poll shows, too much attention to what the latest clever political consultant is recommending, and not enough attention to basic decency and basic principle and basic fairness in the way we approach our problems.
We'll get a call from Louisiana. Good morning. New Rose, Louisiana.
Yes, how you doing? Okay, I had a question for Mr. Pat and Mr. McGovern. On the tax situation, when people getting taxed, to me, in my opinion, it seems like the lower class people are not getting taxed at all. I'm going to give you an example right quick. Okay, down where I live at, they have people making, say, about 35, 40 grand a year. You know, that's their household income. They paying $180 a month for medical insurance. They paying taxes. At the end of the year, they got to pay more taxes. But then again, you got people making, say, about 20, 25 grand. They're not paying any taxes. They're getting unearned income back, and possibly they're getting free medical insurance. And I don't think that's fair. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to get at.
I do understand. Let me first. The fellow making $20,000, probably the largest share of his federal taxes is certainly for Medicare and Social Security, because that cuts in very, very low. There's no doubt that the federal income tax doesn't cut in, I think, for a family of 4. My guess would be until you get to 13 or 14 up in that area. So his income tax is going to be smaller than his Social Security taxes, but he's paying sales taxes. I do think there is an issue, and I don't know exactly how to deal with it, of inequity, where if your income falls below a certain level, you get benefits that the fellow just above them doesn't get. In other words, the working poor who just get out of this area lose a lot of benefits that they see the folks who aren't working as hard getting. And this is a problem, and I don't know how exactly you deal with that once you start giving out benefits to the lowest income.
I think what the gentleman's referring to is the so-called earned income tax credit, under which low-income people get a little tax break, provided they keep working. The reason for that was to give those people a little break over those who are purely on welfare. The way the system worked prior to the earned income tax credit is that if your income went up a little bit, the tax bite offset any advantage that it would have, and so people would say, I might just well stay on welfare.
There was a program back in '72 to give $1,000 to every man, woman, and child in America, Senator.
It wasn't too bad an idea. It was a subsidy.
As we said, we got Nelson Rockefeller to come out and say, I don't need it.
Last question for both of you before we let you go on this Sunday. Outside of your family, who influenced you the most in shaping your ideology when you were younger?
Franklin Roosevelt. I grew up at a time when I didn't know there was any other president. He was elected 4 times while I was a youngster growing up out in South Dakota, and was a pilot in World War II. He was our commander-in-chief, so he influenced me more than any other single figure.
It's probably, I would have to say, other than my father, conservative, an early Roosevelt, not a late Roosevelt man, it would be Barry Goldwater, whose book I read in 1960 or 61, for basically on philosophy and supporting him. But on strategy and tactics and a lot of things, it's Richard Nixon. He was a mentor for 3 years, from 1965 to 1969, or 4 years in there, and I work with him every single day very closely, and he's an extraordinary figure, and not a philosophical conservative, an instinctive conservative in some ways.
You both read a lot of books. Who is a must-read author in your mind?
Well, I mentioned one early on in this program, Bob Rice, the former Secretary of Labor. That book, Locked in the Cabinet, is really his diary during the first 4 years of the Clinton administration. But it's a book I hope everybody in the administration will read and think about, and as many other Americans as who can get a copy of it.
You get the last word. Who is a must-read author for you?
Well, it's someone who's become a friend of mine, is Bob Farrell. He's a historian. I'll bet he's close to 80 years old now, in his book on American diplomacy. I would really encourage young Americans and students to go back and read these outstanding diplomatic histories of America's wars and their tariff battles, so they really steep themselves in the old arguments and debates, because I think there's a lot of shallowness right now and, you know, cliches in a lot of our arguments and debates, which we could do away with if people saw the origins of these great battles in our history.
So do you enjoy C-SPAN or Crossfire more? You have more time here.
I don't watch Crossfire. I do Crossfire, but as you know, we got the clicker, and see, it's right here on C-SPAN. We see a lot of you, Steve, and a lot of Brian and everyone here. We enjoy them both.
Pat Buchanan, thank you very much. George McGovern, thank you. Hope you will both
Steve.
come back again. You're always welcome. And we'll be right back.